This brief presentation reviews the research project outcome 3, which relates to reflections on your research process. It's a very brief presentation overviewing what reflections are, type of models that are used for reflection, tools that are used to help with reflection, and trying to offer you some suggestions as to how to structure your reflections essay. This presentation does not go into any great depth about reflections. That's for you to go and research in literature and find appropriate references. But I hope as a presentation will provide awareness about reflections and stimulate some ideas that you can then develop for your essay. So anyway, let's go through the Learning Outcome 3. I'm going to just take you through the requirements of Learning Outcome 3. A lot of this is in your book already and that we handed out. So Learning Outcome 3 then is about the reflection on the impact of the research experience could have in enhancing your personal or group performance within an engineering context. So the pass criterion P5 it says to reflect on the effectiveness and the impact that the experience has had on enhancing your personal and group performance. If you want to attempt higher grades, then there's a merit grade. This is where you have to evaluate the benefits from the findings of the research you've conducted. And D3, as they call it, the distinction grade, you've got to critically evaluate how the research experience enhances personal or group performance within an engineering context. So they're all linking together a bit here. I just put these command words down because BTEC always use these command words. And one command word they didn't have was reflect. So they have it on their criteria, but they don't actually have it in their literature, what actually reflect means. So we haven't got their context of what reflect means, but generally speaking, it just simply means to think carefully about something. So it's not in a BTEC document. I think reflection is reasonably obvious compared to some of the terms. Evaluate, which they use for their merit grades. This again is from the BTEC document, what they mean by evaluate. It says the work will draw upon varied information, themes or concepts to consider aspects such as strengths and weaknesses. So of course they're talking about your findings here. So strengths and weaknesses of your findings from research, advantages and disadvantages, alternative actions that could be undertaken, the relevance or the significance of what you've done. So in the context of your findings, and those fit quite nicely, you could apply those. Students' inquiries should lead to a supported judgment showing relationship to this context. Evidence will be written. It will be, in your case, given through a presentation. But you're going to produce an essay for me in this particular part. So that's what they mean by evaluate. That's the merit grade. So evaluate your findings. That's some of the things you should be considering. And if you want to go to the higher grades, the critically evaluate. Is again from BTEC. It says you have to make judgments taking into account different factors using available knowledge, experience, evidence, where the judgment is supported in depth and give good justification as to why what you're saying is valid, really. So when I say critically evaluate, it'll be more engagement. The distinction grade there builds on the pass criteria there, so it's kind of where the pass criteria is highlighting issues associated with reflection. And the distinction grade is sort of critically evaluating what you've highlighted to give some justifications to why what you say is relevant or applicable. So in our background document that you were given, you will find in this research project information sort of background document, you will find some information on the reflection. It's actually, I think, in section 5 of your document, and it goes through some various sections there, which I'm going to outline anyway, some very briefly outline. There's much more details in those sections. So I would encourage you to look at the Learning Outcome 3 in that little booklet and have a little browse of some of the information there. And then you can go off and find your own information as you want to, okay? So let me take you through this is some of the extracts from the booklet. I'm just briefly overviewing some things here, just to try and get you in the mindset of reflection, because again, it can be quite a difficult topic to engage with, really. It's kind of not something perhaps we've engaged with before even, but it is quite a subject in its own right. Lots of authors out there that publish theories and models associated with reflection, and I do personally think it is a very valid aspect of your time to actually reflect on something. I know years ago as an industry, I was running a project for 18 months and it was quite pressurised at the time, and there were sort of hiccups along the way, things didn't go too well. And I always, because I was planning the project, I gave myself a week at the end of this 18 months. I planned this week, which was really for reflection, for thinking back on all the things that went wrong. But I was going to do some sort of really thinking back at some of the problems, and I got to day 2 of my week, and I suddenly got seconded to another job. So I was on another contract then, and so my reflection days got lost. But I did think when I was in industry, and I still think now, that reflection is quite a useful exercise to do, particularly in teaching. When you reflect on how you delivered topics and things went, I think it's very useful in the teaching profession. And maybe you might find reflection useful, in your own working environment once you understand what reflection actually is. We're just going to consider key features of reflection here. So 4 little statements here. Reflection results in learning. So it can change your ideals and your understanding of the situation. By reflecting on something, it can change your perspectives, it can change your future intentions, your future direction. So it's useful in that respect. Statement 2 there, reflection can be active and dynamic process. And if you look in the literature, there are actually 3 types of reflection. It's often purported. There's something called reflecting on action. That's looking back on past experiences, like I was intending to do in industry, to look back at some of the issues we'd had along the way in design process, in the stress analysis process. That's reflection on action. There's something called reflection in action, and that's reflecting on an incident that's just happened. I always think that's a more difficult thing, because if you go back to industry, when you're in heat of battle, when you're trying to do lots of work, it's sometimes difficult to sort of find time to sort of just sit down and sort of reflect on what's just happened. It's not quite so easy, but something called reflecting in action, when things are actually happening in the heat of battle, and something called reflection for action, so actions that you take to benefit future research or future work that you undertake. So you may want to engage with one or all of them in your essay. I will leave that to you as how you want to overview your essay. 3, reflection is not a linear process, it is cyclic, and you'll see in the models in a moment. There's some various models that can be used. They're all cyclic models. It leads to the development of new ideas that can be used to plan the next stages of learning as the research unfolds or new research begins. Okay, so you reflect on something, you might implement something, you then see how that has implemented, what the effect of that is, and then you might reflect on that, and so on. And so it's kind of a cyclic process, kind of evolving process, really. And 4, their reflection encourages consideration of different perspectives, and I do think that's quite a valid statement, that because as you reflect on what's happened, situations, it can sometimes change your perspectives. It helps you understand and it helps you scrutinize your own beliefs, your values, your assumptions and your perspectives on situations. So it can be good from that point of view to reflect. So here's some models. I'm only going to show you 3 here. There are many more. When I browse students' work from previous years, they did use other ones. They went out and got their own models, and that's absolutely fine. If you feel that these models are not going to work for you, or you can find better models, then feel free to use them, okay? Because this is really an open essay as far as I'm concerned. I try and run with whatever you give me, as long as it's going to hit the criteria that we've got to assess. I'm absolutely fine with that. So I'm just going to give you just some 3 models to set your thinking about the type of models that are out there, and then you can go away and either research deeper into these models or find your own models. I would encourage you, though, to base your reflection around the model. I think it does give you structure when you're doing reflection. So that would be my suggestion. So the first one is Bould's model, the reflective cycle model. He's got 3 stages in the process of reflection, learning and experience. So there's this little cycle. Again, like I said, there's cyclic kind of models here. You have an experience, you have a reflection on it, you have some learning undertaken. This is a sort of questions you ask in the experience. That's the kind of the what, describing the events that have happened. Then reflection, the so what, sort of understanding the events, drilling into the events as to what it actually means, and then the now what, as he terms it there, so what we've learned and what can we do to improve on the performance or improve on the situation. So a simple model there, as it says. If you overview, it's a very simple model. Reflection leads to further learning. The model does capture essentials, but the model doesn't guide as to how reflection might lead to further learning. So when you research in your models, you'll find there will be good and bad points about each of the models, and you can use compare and contrast models if you want to. And that's just a very brief overview of some of the aspects of it. People like that because it's simple, but it doesn't necessarily engage you fully into what you've actually found from the reflection. So there's your first model. Second model is Gibbs cyclic model. There's 6 stages in Gibbs model. That's the experience, actually the what's happened. Gibbs model brings in feelings, which the Bowles model doesn't. So what were your feelings about this particular experience? And it evaluates what was the good and bad points about the situation. You've got analysis, how to make sense of the situation and your reflection on it, some kind of conclusion, what else could have been done is put there, and then an action plan of what would you do next time. So that's the cyclic model given there. So a more advanced model than the first model I showed you brings in feelings, when I think again that's kind of a relevant issue when you're reflecting, you're personalizing and bringing your own perspectives, your own belief system, if you like, in on this. So it can affect the way you reflect and what you choose to reflect on, possibly. You may be subconsciously filtering out certain things. So I think having the feeling section there is probably quite a useful exercise. So it's an overview of the model. The model does acknowledge that personal feelings and influences the reflections that you undertake. And the model does break down reflections into the evaluation analysis stage to try and aid understanding. But some of the criticisms of this model, that though it's a very detailed process, and the model is still considered to be fairly superficial, in that will learning result from change of assumptions, perspectives, or practice? If you read around this model, you'll see some people are quite critical of it in that respect. Is that, okay, you go through this process, but do you actually force any learning to come out of it? Have you got a change of perspectives that's come out of the reflection? The model doesn't really sort of guarantee that with the way it's devised, but nevertheless a more thorough model than the first model. And here's a third model for your reference. The Atkins and Murphy's cyclical model has 5 stages in the process. Starts with an awareness of discomfort or action experience. Situation is then described to include the important feelings, thoughts, events, and features. Next stage is to analyze the feelings and the knowledge. So identify and challenge assumptions, generate and explore alternatives. Try to evaluate the relevance of the knowledge found. Does this help to explain and resolve the problem that occurred? And then identify any learning that has occurred. In overview, this model supports a deeper level of reflection. It tends to avoid superficial responses by explicitly identifying challenges and assumptions, generates and explores alternatives, and evaluates the relevance and the impact of these. The model had a specific stage for endeavouring to identify learning that has occurred. So a third model for your reference. So reflective learning. A lot of people think, and I do agree with this myself, is that reflection should be seen as a sort of a strategic study technique, something that you build into your everyday practice, really. But reflective learning is highly individual, as your essay will be, because although you'll all be talking about probably very similar models, but the way you apply them will be different. What you will engage with will be different, because your contexts are different in your, some are qualitative, some are quantitative, for example. So that affected the way you apply your models in the reflections you engage with. Consider reflective learning as something to practice at any stage. As it did say, we've got sort of 3 types of reflection. So you can actually apply reflection on something that's already past, something that's present, or something that how you're going to handle something in the future. So you can practice at any time this reflection approach, and become used to reflecting on your own experiences as part of everyday learning. So it's all time consuming, but sometimes it is good just to sort of sit down with a mind map, for example, and think about a problem you've had and how maybe you could have solved it differently or approached it differently, with a bit of reflection. Perhaps it wasn't the best thing to do that particular way, whatever. So if you can build this into your general working practice, it is quite good. As though I said, from my experience, sometimes you don't always get the time, even when you're trying to allocate it. And this way, each experience, positive or negative, will contribute to your development and personal growth. So that's how some people see the use of reflection as a very, very useful aspect to development. So it's therefore worth noting the following. See reflection as complementary to your study. Use it to clarify your thoughts and focus on your personal and professional development. Record your thoughts on any difficulties or challenges you are facing. This is where logbooks are particularly useful. I mean, I hope you've been keeping a logbook along the way, because it's quite useful to document sort of problems you had along the way, where you overcome them, that kind of thing. And think about strategies that might help you overcome difficult tasks. So it's just a sort of something to build into your general working environment if you can. The tools that support your reflection process. Now, hopefully you have a logbook, because I do think the logbook is very useful. If you kept a logbook ongoing, I keep a logbook when I'm undertaking my research, mainly because I want to document what I've done in a week, because I know some of you have commented, and I quite relate to this, when you're doing research, you have to put it to one side for a few weeks for whatever reasons, and pick it up again can be quite difficult. Finding the threads of the research again, the thought process that you were trying to go through, it's not always easy, I have to say, and that's where I find a logbook really useful, sort of to get me back into where I'm thinking. I'm still trying to do some research of my own, but I've had to drop it for about 4 months now. So when I do get back in, it'll be about 5 or 6 months before I've looked at the research. But I know I have a logbook, and I know that I had an entry in the last time I looked at it, and it told me what that entry will tell me what I was thinking at the time and what I was planning to do at the time. So I will have some sort of hook onto where I was with my thought process and what my intentions were, because I know it's in the logbook. I do keep those kind of entries. Every time I finish working on the research, I stop myself and I write up my current thinking and my current status of the research, and that might hopefully help me get back into it when eventually I do, if and when I do. So logbooks or journals are very useful, helping with reflection. So, put in warts and all, of course, in the logbook. All the good and the bad points go into the logbook, because they're all to be reflected on. Mind maps, of course, very useful. I know some of you use mind maps, very nice visual representations with the diagrams and the sketches and the cartoons and use of colour. So they're useful, and they're creative tools that helps you structure, categorise and make connections between your ideas when you're reflecting. And some students use in the previous years, they use these days audiovisual material. Some were recording, I know, on their phones. They're sort of like almost memos to themselves about issues, and some are actually video recordings, very small video recordings. Of course, you can do that all quite easily now with phones and so on. So another tool, if you like, that might help you with capturing information, capturing situations, and then being able to reflect on them later. Just going to outline here what I think might be some considerations for you related to the criterion we're given when it says reflect on the effectiveness and the impact of the research experience it's had upon your enhancing your personal and group performance. So what I've tried to do here is just give you some ideas as to the way you might want to consider your personal reflection. So this is personal reflections on this slide in consideration. So what's the effectiveness, what's the impact of, for example, going right back to the selection of the project. Is there anything we reflect on the project you've chosen, looking back on that? Was that a good choice? Were there reasons why you chose that perhaps, was there a reason why that you chose that project, and maybe looking back on it, maybe it wasn't it snowballed to a situation where perhaps it's not so appropriate. But you could certainly go right back to the beginning and look at the idea behind the project proposal. Developing your research skills. Have you found that the research you've undertaken, do you think it's developed your research skills, your experience and so on? Has it developed your reading and writing skills? Writing is quite an art. So the more you write, the more you develop that skill. Have your writing improved, for example? Is that something that the research you've done, has that enhanced your writing skills? Maybe use of software, use of bibliographic packages may be useful to you in other areas. Maybe when you do reports for work, you might be able to use now that kind of software. You've had to run this project yourself, research project on your own. You are running your project. You have had to have effective time management. You have college and work in personal life. You've had to manage that. Has there been any issues about that you can feel that is impacted on the effectiveness of this research project? This is one I've got this one because it was actually in a student's report from last year, which I thought I would highlight this one. Reflecting on anxiety, stress levels, and self-confidence. How that's evolved throughout the project process. How has that changed for you over the duration? Your working environment, you've also been working totally online, for example, haven't you? You could reflect on the good and bad points of that and how that's impacted on your effectiveness or your performance. The literature review itself is a very demanding aspect of the unit, and you could reflect on that, developing questionnaires, surveys, interview schedules, and undertaking them as well, collecting, analysing, preparing, presenting data. Has there been improvements in your personal performance, would you say? Improvements to promotional prospects within and outside of the current employment? How's that going to affect you, do you think? If somebody last year was worried about what their findings were, they had to present it to the management, and they thought that would be the end of their career at the company if they presented the findings as they had devised them. So it was a bit of an issue. That's where I got the stress and anxiety from, in that particular area. P5 again, just now considering group performance, a bit more difficult possibly, but group considerations. And you can think of group considerations being for the company as a whole. It could be for the team you're involved with or a department you're involved with, or you could think of it for the customers. Reflect on the effectiveness of the impact the experience has had on group performance. Well, how could the research experience aid improvement for your company in any way? You may want to think of it from that perspective, what you've done, your findings, whatever your approach to it all. How is that going to impact on the company? Is that'll benefit to them? How might the research findings be a benefit to the customer, for example, or to your department, your team, or to the management, to the marketing department, to the industry sector as a whole even? What about your improved time management, aid performance at work? Does that have any benefits for the group as such in any way, shape or form? Maybe the development of your knowledge and the application of the research methods might benefit the organisation. What about this one, the ethical knowledge and practice? Most of you have gone through an ethical considerations, and it's something we probably don't normally do. Has that any impact on, could affect the company performance or the team performance or the group performance and that kind of thing? Or maybe you're working with others is sometimes used. Your research experience, would that affect the way you work with others, because you've had to go through interviewing, analysis of what people say if you're doing the qualitative work and so on? And how might the development of your presentation skills benefit the company, because you're going to do ultimately a presentation in executive summary, which would be the final outcome. And again, that's very good skills there, because it's writing skills, very concise to produce an executive summary, very coherent. And again, those skills might develop you personally, but they also might be of benefit to the company or to your team or your manager, whatever. Just think of it in a sort of wider context. So I don't know if that helps you or not to think of how to answer P5. And just suggesting these things to you. You may be able to bite on some, you may ignore some, you may have your own ideas of what you want to do from your own context. But I'm just trying to give you sort of some ideas here as to how you might approach P5. And this is the suggested essay for your reflections essay. So it's just a suggested structure. You do not have to use it if you don't want to, but if it gives you something to start off with, then I would run with it and then modify it as you want to. So I would suggest what you need to do first of all with this is to go off and find out what reflection is. What does it mean to you? What do you glean when you start reading the literature associated with this? And I would also describe the types of reflection. We've already mentioned on action, in action, and for action. You may want to engage with those. And then I would suggest to have a little section on models. You might want to encompass several different models there. Models maybe the I haven't shown you because you find better models or more models more applicable to what you're considering or your situation. But I was thinking there'd be some discussion about models, because I would encourage you to use a model. And you may also want to bring into the discussion the tools that support reflection. We've mentioned a few of them. You may have others, tools you've used to help you with the reflection, so you could bring them in there. I would also outline the research context in which reflection is being centred. So I would actually now put a little bit of your project in here. So we've sort of looked at the big picture reflection, types of reflection models and that kind of thing, and now we're kind of into your context and how we're going to perhaps apply them into your context. And in section 6, as I've labelled it here, this would be the main section where you would have your reflection. So this is where you reflect on your personal, group, company performance during your research. So I would encourage you to use some kind of reflection model as a basis here. Okay, so section 6 is the biggie. That's where you will engage with this. I looked at typical word counts, and normally about 2,000 words is what I was finding from students from previous years. So it gives you a target. I'm not saying you have to do 2,000. Some people did way more than 2,000. So, I'm not I don't want to tie you down tightly, but I would say 2,000 words didn't seem unreasonable from what I've seen before from students for a reflection P5. If you want to do the higher grades, then you'll have sections 7 and 8 here. So 7 will be the evaluate benefits from your findings now of your research that's undertaken. And then section 8 is to critically evaluate on how the research experience enhances personal or group performance within your industrial context. And that's really picking up on section 6 really, and just giving more justification, more detail about what you found in section 6. And then we conclude section 9, what you've learned from your reflections and your references to finish. Okay, so that would be a suggestion for the essay on reflections, which is for learn outcome 3. So that's about it. That's about as much as I wanted to say on reflections. It's really for you to go and engage level 5 students anyway now. So I know from the work you've done already, you're very adept at finding information and presenting it really well. And so I've no doubt you'll do a good job on this, but that might give you a little bit of structure as to where I'd be thinking of producing the essay here. And here's the bibliography used to help generate this presentation.